Let the room grow dim around you now, and imagine with me a different kind of darkness. The soft glow of candles in a Georgian drawing room, the flicker of lamplight on cobblestones, the warm amber light that once fell across a woman's face as she became, without quite choosing to, one of the most talked about figures in all of England. This is not a quiet story, though we will tell it quietly. It is the story of how private sin became public entertainment, how a woman's reputation could be lifted from the intimate spaces of bedchamber and bathhouse and transformed into a national pastime, bought and sold like any other commodity in the marketplace of Georgian scandal. She had more than one name, as women of her station often did. Born Seymour Dorothy Fleming, a name that carried the weight of baronetcy and inheritance, she would later become Lady Seymour Worsley, a title that would glitter and then tarnish in the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. But beneath these formal masks, beneath the silk and the ceremonies and the carefully choreographed performances of respectability, there lived a woman whose desires and choices would be dissected with a kind of gleeful cruelty that tells us as much about her world as it does about her. So settle deeper into your pillow now, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift back across the centuries to meet a woman who dared to want, who dared to choose, and who paid for those decisions in the cold currency of scandal and shame, her most private moments transformed into prints and pamphlets, and whispered gossip that spread like wildfire through the coffee houses and salons of 18th century London. To understand what happened to Seymour Worsley, you must first understand the world that shaped her, a world of rigid hierarchies and unforgiving double standards where women existed as symbols of virtue while men were afforded a latitude so generous it barely qualified as restriction at all. Female desire was not simply discouraged. It was policed, marketed, and punished with a thoroughness that reveals how deeply society feared the consequences of women who might choose for themselves. A respectable woman was expected to be a perfect ornament, her body and behavior carefully cultivated to reflect well upon her father, then her husband, her own wishes subordinate to the grand project of maintaining family honor and social standing. The legal reality was even more stark than the social one, though the two worked hand in hand to constrain women's lives in ways both visible and invisible. Under the doctrine of coverture, which governed marriage law in Georgian England, a married woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property in her own name, could not sign contracts, could not keep her own earnings if she had any. Marriage functioned less like a partnership and more like a transfer of control, with the woman passing from her father's governance to her husband's as completely as if she were a piece of estate. Her body, her reputation, her very selfhood became his to manage, and if she strayed, if she dared to seek affection or pleasure outside the bonds of matrimony, the law offered him recourse to reclaim his property or seek compensation for the injury done to his honor. But perhaps the most insidious engine of control was neither law nor custom but something more modern, more commercial, more recognizably cruel to our contemporary eyes. The gossip economy that fed on scandal like fuel. By the 1750s and 1760s, London had become a city of newspapers and pamphlets and satirical prints, each competing to capture the public's insatiable appetite for the private failures of the wealthy and titled. Scandal was not whispered discreetly behind fans and then forgotten. It was printed, illustrated, sold on street corners, collected by gentlemen in portfolios they kept in their libraries. The machinery of public humiliation had become a profitable industry. And a woman like Seymour Worsley, beautiful and titled and reckless enough to transgress, would find herself not simply condemned but commodified, her intimate moments rendered in ink and copper plate for the titillation of strangers who would never know her name before they knew her shame. She was born in 1758, in that moment of the century when England was still finding its footing after decades of war and political upheaval, a daughter who arrived into the world carrying the weight of inheritance before she could possibly understand what it meant. Her father was Sir John Fleming, 1st Baronet, a man of property and standing, and her mother was Jane Coleman, though history has preserved far less about her than about the fortune and title she helped produce. Seymour Dorothy Fleming entered a world of privilege, certainly, but also a world where every comfort came with invisible chains, where being born female and wealthy meant being valuable in ways that had nothing to do with your own desires or dreams. The early loss that would reshape her childhood came swiftly and without mercy. Her father died when she was still young, too young to fully grasp how thoroughly his absence would reorganize the landscape of her life. Suddenly, she was not simply a daughter but an heiress, a girl whose worth was measured in estates and investments and the future alliances her marriage might secure. Guardianship, that cold legal term, became the framework of her upbringing, her life managed by men who had a vested interest in preserving her value until she could be properly transferred to a husband. Picture it now as you drift toward sleep. Gilded rooms where the light falls through tall windows onto furniture too fine to touch carelessly, strict tutors who taught her to read and embroider and perform the delicate social graces expected of a woman of quality, and always, always, the knowledge that her future had already been written in the ledgers of inheritance and duty, a script she would be expected to follow without deviation or complaint. When Seymour came of age and entered the glittering circles of fashionable London society, she arrived with all the advantages that wealth and breeding could provide, but also with the burden of being perpetually watched, perpetually judged, her every movement scrutinized for signs of virtue or its absence. She was beautiful. The historical record makes this clear. And beauty in a woman of her station was both currency and danger, something to be displayed but never too freely, something to attract the right kind of attention without inviting the wrong kind of speculation. The performance of femininity demanded grace and charm held in perfect tension with restraint, a smile that welcomed but did not promise, eyes that sparkled but did not smolder, a presence that suggested availability for marriage while never hinting at any more immediate or carnal form of desire. But even before any actual transgression, even before the scandals that would consume her later life, Seymour was already becoming a story that people told about her, her name spoken in drawing rooms and whispered behind gloved hands. With a quality of fascination that suggested she was not quite like the other well-bred young women making their careful way through the marriage market. There was something about her, an intensity, perhaps, or a refusal to perform meekness with quite enough conviction, that made her memorable, made her the subject of speculation and rumor even when her actual behavior remained within the bounds of propriety. The public ownership of her private life began here, in these early years, when admiring eyes followed her across ballrooms, when fans fluttered a little faster as she passed, when a smile held a second too long could become fodder for gossip that would ripple outward through the intricate social networks of Georgian London, transforming a moment of genuine warmth or simple flirtation into evidence of a nature too passionate to be properly contained. The marriage came in the early 1770s, When Seymour was still very young, still learning the rules of the game she would eventually break so spectacularly. Sir Richard Worsley was everything a respectable match should be. Titled, wealthy, ambitious, a man of public standing with estates that spoke of generations of accumulated privilege. When Seymour Fleming became Lady Worsley, she acquired not just a new name but a new identity entirely, one that came with expectations as precise and unyielding as the boning in her corsets. She was to be decorative, loyal, and above all quiet, her role to reflect well upon her husband's reputation while managing his household with efficiency and grace, producing heirs to carry on his line and otherwise making herself useful without ever becoming troublesome or demanding. Appledurcombe House, the Worsley seat on the Isle of Wight, became the stage for this performance of marital duty. A grand estate where the weight of history pressed down on every interaction, where Sir Richard pursued his ambitions in politics and public life while Seymour navigated the lonelier terrain of domesticity and social obligation. He was duty-bound, conscious always of his position and the scrutiny that came with it, and she was expected to be the perfect ornament to his public persona, beautiful and accomplished but never overshadowing, present but never too present, a wife who understood that her husband's career and reputation took precedence over any personal desires she might harbor. A son arrived early in the marriage, as sons were expected to do, and with his birth came the complicated emotional landscape of motherhood lived under constant observation, where even the most tender moments between mother and child could become subject to judgment, where affection itself had to be measured and appropriate, never excessive, never suggesting that a woman might find more fulfillment in her children than in the careful maintenance of her husband's good name. But beneath the polished surface of respectability, fractures were forming in the marriage, quiet fault lines that would eventually split open into public catastrophe. For a woman in Seymour's position, the stakes of any misstep were impossibly high. A flirtation that in a man would be dismissed as harmless gallantry could become, in her case, evidence of moral corruption, desire itself transformed into a kind of crime for which she alone would be held accountable. Sir Richard, like most men of his class and era, could pursue his pleasures with relative impunity, could maintain friendships with women that might cross into something warmer without facing the social annihilation that awaited a wife who did the same. The double standard was not some abstract principle but a lived reality that shaped every interaction, every choice, every moment of connection that might bloom into something forbidden. Rumors began to circulate, as rumors always did around women who seemed too vital, too present, too unwilling to disappear into the comfortable anonymity of perfect wifely devotion. Whispers of affairs followed Seymour through drawing rooms and across dance floors, stories that may or may not have had any basis in truth but that adhered to her nonetheless because they fit the narrative that society wanted to tell about her. A beautiful woman married to a man who could not hold her attention, a passionate nature inadequately contained by the bonds of matrimony, desire leaking out around the edges of propriety like light through a badly fitted door. These whispers became a kind of soundtrack to her life, never quite loud enough to constitute proof of actual wrongdoing but persistent enough to mark her as suspect, to ensure that every gesture would be interpreted through the lens of suspicion, every friendship scrutinized for signs of transgression, her reputation becoming something that existed independently of her actual behavior, a story the public was writing about her whether she participated in its composition or not. Into this volatile landscape came Captain George Bisset, sometimes called Maurice in the records that survive him, a military man who entered the Worsley household first as a friend to Sir Richard, their connection forged in the masculine world of clubs and campaigns where men built alliances that could last a lifetime. Proximity created opportunity, as it so often does. Shared dinners around the Worsley table, shared conversations in drawing rooms where the candles burned low and the wine flowed freely, shared glances that lingered just a moment longer than friendship strictly required. The intimacy that grew between Seymour and Bisset was conducted in full view of her husband, and here the story takes on a complexity that refuses easy moral categorization, because the historical evidence suggests that Sir Richard not only tolerated but actively encouraged the connection between his wife and his friend, creating the conditions for an affair that he would later use as ammunition in a very public quest for compensation and revenge. The reasons for this encouragement remain shadowy and speculative. Perhaps he found the arrangement convenient, a way to maintain his own freedom while keeping his wife occupied and apparently content. Perhaps there was some element of voyeuristic pleasure in orchestrating their intimacy, or perhaps he simply miscalculated, believing he could control the boundaries of their relationship and discovering too late that desire has a logic of its own that refuses to be managed or contained. Whatever his motivations, the triangle that formed was one he helped construct, and the scandal that would eventually consume all three of them was one he had a hand in creating. Let your mind drift now over the sensual textures of that time. A shared house where every room held the possibility of encounter, a shared table where feet might brush beneath the linen cloth, a shared existence that blurred the lines between friendship and something far more dangerous, glances that communicated what words could not safely say, touches that pretended to be accidental but carried the electric charge of deliberate transgression. But of all the moments in this tangled story, one stands out with a clarity that cuts through the centuries, an incident so perfectly calibrated to become public spectacle that it almost seems staged for the scandal sheets that would eventually devour it. Picture a women's bathhouse, a place of steam and privacy where bodies could shed the constraints of corsetry and propriety, where skin met warm water in an atmosphere of intimate relaxation far removed from the public gaze. Seymour was there, as women of her class sometimes were, seeking perhaps some respite from the relentless performance of femininity, some moment of physical comfort in a world that so often denied women access to simple bodily pleasure. And Bisset was there too, or rather above, positioned at a high window, lifted up by Sir Richard himself so that he might look down into that private female space and observe what was never meant to be observed, the wife's body displayed for the friend's viewing pleasure in an act that combined voyeurism, violation, and a kind of grotesque theatricality that would later become central to the public understanding of their relationship. The thematic punch of this moment cannot be overstated. Here was privacy cracked open like an egg, intimacy transformed into spectacle, a woman's body turned into an object of exchange between men who treated her as a commodity rather than a person with her own agency or dignity. The bathhouse scene was almost pre-packaged for scandal, a perfect anecdote that could be told and retold in increasingly salacious variations, illustrated in satirical prints that would circulate through London's print shops, transformed from a private moment into public property with a speed and thoroughness that demonstrates just how efficient the machinery of Georgian scandal had become. What happened in that bathhouse would follow Seymour for the rest of her life, a story about her that was never truly hers, that reduced her to a body on display and erased entirely the complicated humanity that might have explained how she arrived at such a moment in the first place. The breaking point came when whispers could no longer contain the truth. Seymour and Bisset eloped, leaving behind the pretense of propriety and the increasingly untenable triangle that had defined their shared existence. Elopement was not simply romantic rebellion but an act of profound legal, financial, and social peril, especially for a woman who had everything to lose and very little to gain beyond the uncertain promise of affection freely given rather than contractual obligated. For Sir Richard, the elopement represented a public humiliation that could not be ignored or quietly managed, his wife's departure with his friend transforming private marital discord into a spectacle that demanded response, and the response he chose was the courtroom. That most public of stages where private grievances could be aired before an audience hungry for every sordid detail. Titillation turned to headline sensation as the story spread beyond the confines of London's fashionable circles and into the broader public consciousness. Newspapers seized upon the scandal with undisguised glee, their coverage transforming the elopement from a personal tragedy into a form of mass entertainment, complete with moral commentary, salacious speculation, and the kind of breathless reporting that made readers feel as though they had intimate knowledge of events from which they were actually quite removed. The machinery of publicity ground into full operation, and Seymour found herself at the center of a storm she could neither control nor escape, her name on everyone's lips, her choices debated in coffeehouses and taverns, her reputation dissected with a cruelty that was all the more vicious for being conducted in public, under the guise of moral instruction and social commentary. The trial itself was conducted under the banner of criminal conversation, a legal mechanism that sounds almost quaint to modern ears but that revealed the brutal reality of how Georgian law understood marriage and adultery. In simple terms, criminal conversation allowed a husband to sue his wife's lover for damages, treating the wife herself not as a participant with agency but as a form of property that had been damaged or stolen, her infidelity framed as an injury done to the husband's honor and his exclusive right to her sexual and reproductive capacity. The courtroom became a stage where private intimacies were performed for public consumption, where the details of who touched whom and when and how were laid out with a precision that satisfied both legal requirements and popular prurience, where Seymour's body and choices were discussed as though she were not a person but an object over which two men disputed ownership. But the trial did not unfold as Sir Richard had hoped, because the evidence that emerged painted a far more complicated picture than simple adultery. The bathhouse incident, meant to prove Bisset's transgression, instead raised uncomfortable questions about Sir Richard's own role in facilitating and even encouraging the affair, his complicity undermining his claim to be an injured husband deserving of substantial compensation. When the jury delivered their verdict, they awarded Sir Richard damages of only 1 shilling. A symbolic amount that communicated clearly their belief that he had contributed to his own cuckolding, that he had no right to profit from a situation he had helped create. The case backfired spectacularly, transforming Sir Richard from wronged husband into laughingstock, but the real victim of the trial's publicity was Seymour herself, whose private life had been thoroughly dissected and whose reputation was now permanently marked by scandal, regardless of the jury's implicit acknowledgement that the situation was far more complex than the law's rigid categories of virtue and vice could accommodate. This is where the story becomes most recognizably modern, most uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has watched contemporary scandal unfold in the age of social media and viral content. The trial coverage spread like wildfire, but it did not stop at mere reporting. It metastasized into entertainment, into art, into commerce. The great satirist James Gilray, whose sharp eye for hypocrisy and whose technical brilliance with the engraving tool made him one of the most influential artists of his era, turned his attention to the Worsley scandal and produced prints that rendered the bathhouse scene and other incidents from the trial in exquisite, damning detail. These were not private sketches but commercial products, sold in print shops across London, collected by gentlemen who kept them in portfolios alongside other examples of satirical and salacious art, displayed and discussed and passed around like any other commodity in the marketplace of Georgian culture. The British Museum's collection notes are revealing in their own right, documenting both the suppression of certain particularly explicit images connected to the Worsley scandal and the high demand that persisted for any visual representation of the story, a demand so strong that rarity only increased desirability and price. Seymour's body, her choices, her most intimate moments had become literally printable, buyable, collectible. She had been transformed from a person into a product, her scandal not just discussed but illustrated for mass consumption. As you settle deeper into sleep, let yourself feel the cruel thrill of that crowd, the way they consumed her humiliation with a hunger that tells us as much about their own appetites as it does about her actual transgressions, the way scandal functioned as a kind of public feast where the suffering of one woman could feed the entertainment needs of thousands. In the wake of the trial, Seymour found herself in a position familiar to many women who had transgressed the bounds of respectability. Shunned by the society that had once welcomed her, her name a byword for scandal, her presence unwanted in the drawing rooms and ballrooms where she had once moved with ease and confidence. Exile became not just metaphorical but literal as she sought refuge abroad, finding in France a distance from English judgement and a culture that, while hardly progressive in its treatment of women, at least offered the possibility of reinvention away from the relentless machinery of British scandal. France meant cheaper rooms in cities where her name carried less weight, stronger perfume to mask the scent of shame, and a kind of freedom that came at the cost of everything she had once known. Her son, her status, her place in the world she had been born into. But Seymour was not content to be merely a victim of the narrative others had constructed around her. The print culture that had profited from her scandal also offered her a means of response, and she made use of pamphlets and poems, contributing to the swirl of texts that circulated around her name, attempting to shape the story in ways that might preserve some shred of dignity or at least complicate the simple morality tale that the public wanted to tell. The historical record preserves fragments of this effort, evidence that she understood the power of narrative and sought, however imperfectly, to wrest some control over how her life would be remembered. Let the image of those Paris rooms settle over you now. The light different than London light, falling through different windows onto furniture that did not carry the weight of English respectability, air that smelled of coffee and bread, and the complicated freedom of starting over in a place where no one quite knew who you were or what you had done, though the story would eventually follow you even there, because scandal in the age of print had a reach that transcended national borders. The years passed, as they always do, and the intensity of public interest in Seymour's scandal gradually diminished, though it never entirely disappeared. Her name remained attached to the story, a cautionary tale trotted out whenever someone wanted to illustrate the dangers of female desire or the consequences of stepping outside the bounds of marital fidelity. Sir Richard Worsley died in 1805, his death releasing Seymour from at least the legal bonds of a marriage that had long since ceased to function in any meaningful sense. With surprising speed, she remarried, taking as her second husband John Louis Couchet, a union that suggests she had not given up on the possibility of companionship or the social legitimacy that marriage could provide, even for a woman whose first marriage had ended in such spectacular public failure. Her later years were spent largely in France, a country that had become more home than England could ever be again, and the historical record grows quiet around her in these decades, the woman who had once been the subject of endless speculation and commentary fading into a kind of peaceful obscurity. This was not a neat moral ending, not a story of redemption or punishment clearly delivered, but rather the messier reality of a life lived in the wake of a public storm. She survived, she adapted, she found ways to continue even after the scandal that might have destroyed someone with less resilience or fewer resources. The emotional arc here is one of endurance rather than triumph, of carving out a life in the margins after the center had expelled her, of learning to exist in a world that had decided who she was long before she had the chance to define herself. She died in 1818, in the Paris suburb of Passy, a place known for its clean air and quiet streets, far removed from the noise and judgment of London society. Her burial at Père Lachaise, the famous cemetery that would become home to so many notable figures, gives her a kind of permanence in the landscape of history, though few visitors to that beautiful necropolis would know her name or the story attached to it. The newspapers that had once devoted columns to her every movement barely noted her passing, if they noted it at all. The scandal that had once seemed so consuming, so important, so worthy of endless discussion had faded into the background noise of history, replaced by newer scandals, fresher meat for the grinder of public entertainment. Close your eyes now and let the image of that final rest settle over you like a blanket, soft and forgiving. The newspapers moved on, as newspapers always do. The crowd that had once consumed her story with such appetite found new scandals to satisfy their hunger. The prints that had circulated through London's shops were filed away in collectors' portfolios, artifacts of a moment rather than living commentary. And one woman, who had been made into a spectacle against her will, who had lived through the transformation of her private life into public property, who had endured exile and reinvention and the long slow fade of notoriety, finally left the stage, her story told and retold and distorted and preserved, but her actual self, the living breathing woman beneath all the narrative, finally allowed to rest in peace. But before we let her rest entirely, before we close the book on Lady Seymour Worsley and drift into our own quiet dreams, it is worth pausing to consider what her story reveals not just about her time but about ours, what the mechanisms of her public humiliation can teach us about the ways we still consume and commodify the private lives of others. Her scandal became a form of commerce because Georgian society had developed the tools to make it so. The law of criminal conversation that treated wives as property, the newspaper industry that fed on sensational stories, the print shops that sold satirical images to a public hungry for titillation disguised as moral instruction. These elements combined to create a machine that could take a woman's most intimate moments and transform them into entertainment, into profit, into a story that circulated far beyond her control or consent. The law itself would eventually change, slowly and imperfectly, as reformers in the 19th century began to dismantle some of the most egregious inequalities embedded in marriage law. Criminal conversation as a legal action was abolished in England as part of broader reforms that gradually, incrementally, began to recognize married women as persons rather than property. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed in stages throughout the 1800s, shifted the legal landscape in ways that would have seemed unimaginable to Seymour and her contemporaries, allowing wives to own property in their own names, to keep their own earnings, to have some measure of legal existence separate from their husbands. These changes came too late for Seymour, of course, but they stand as testimony to the fact that the system that destroyed her was not natural or inevitable but constructed, and what was constructed could be reformed. And yet, as you drift towards sleep, consider this uncomfortable truth. We still click on the stories, we still watch the scandals unfold, we still turn real people's lives into entertainment with a speed and reach that would have astonished even the most industrious Georgian printer. The technology has changed, the platforms are different, but the fundamental appetite remains the same. The desire to peek into private moments, to judge and consume and discuss the intimate details of other people's lives, to feel the frisson of scandal from a safe distance. Lady Seymour Worsley lived in a different world, governed by different laws and different social codes, but the machinery that turned her into a spectacle is not so different from the machinery that operates today, and her story asks us to consider what it means to be the audience for someone else's humiliation. What responsibilities we bear when we participate in the public consumption of private pain. But now, let the analysis fade, let the judgments soften, let the noise of scandal and spectacle grow quiet around you like the dying of embers in a fireplace long after the room has emptied. Scandal is loud, demanding, insistent in its appetite for attention and reaction, but history, real history, the kind that holds space for the full complicated humanity of the people who lived through it, history is gentle and forgiving and ultimately quiet, a soft voice that invites contemplation rather than condemnation. Seymour Dorothy Fleming, Lady Seymour Worsley, the woman beneath all the names and narratives, lived a life that was hers even when others tried to claim ownership of her story, made choices that were hers even when the world insisted on interpreting them only through the lens of scandal and sin, endured what she endured and survived what she survived and finally, mercifully, was allowed to rest. Close the book now, in your mind's eye, let the leather binding settle closed with a soft sound like a sigh. Let the candles that have lit this journey through her life gutter and go out one by one, the wax pooling in silver holders, the flames shrinking to blue before disappearing entirely, leaving only the scent of smoke and the memory of light. Let the room where you've been listening to this story grow softer around you, the edges blurring as sleep approaches, the details fading into the general warmth of rest and darkness and peace. Let her name fade into hush, let the scandal that once seemed so important recede into the background of history where it belongs, let the woman herself, finally, be released from our gaze, our judgment, our endless appetite for turning lives into stories. Sleep now, and let the past be past, and let what was loud become quiet, and let what was spectacle become simply a life lived, as all lives are, in the space between expectation and desire, between the roles we are given and the choices we make, between the public faces we wear and the private selves we protect. Sleep now. Let the story end. Let the candles go out. Let there be, at last, only darkness, and rest, and peace.